Thank you very much to Zehava Galon, the head of Meretz, and we will now try to continue with the previous original order. We'll see if it works. So now, who do we have? What did she say? What did she say? 1 more minute? Okay. What did she say? That I should tell a joke. Oh dear, I have many jokes, but it's a bit dangerous. It might be interpreted as something political, and we are non-political in our institute. But all I can say is that we have presented several questions, as I've said before, but we took it into account that politicians being politicians will say whatever they want, however they want, and it's their prerogative. So we have now reached the Likud representative, and as I've said before, this session was supposed to have been the leaders of the political parties, but the head of the Likud is of course the Prime Minister, and we understand that it's difficult for him to make an appearance, but Minister Gilad Erdan is nevertheless the head of the primaries. He was the first one to be elected in the primary elections. In terms of the vote, so number one in the primary elections is very respectable, and I'm sure that he can speak on behalf of the Likud, so I am now very honored to present Minister Gilad Erdan. Okay, good afternoon. I am very happy and thankful for the invitation and the privilege to be here before you. I heard that, wait, I was told 15 minutes and already I have 14? Okay. Okay, we cannot be leaders by crying, so I'll try to speak. I heard that there have been people before me who said that despite the political security issue at hand, have talked about social aspects as well. I would have liked to talk about the social aspects, but since I was asked here today to give a review or an angle that is more political and security oriented, then I will have to focus on the topic I was asked to speak about. I would therefore like to focus, first of all, on history, because I'm sure that people come here, leaders that are political, and present a certain picture as if things were only in their hands in this day, in this very moment, things would have looked differently. And I think that before we talk about what can or cannot be done, and of course I have the harder and more complicated mission because I have to explain the current government policy and the Prime Minister's policy and what is happening around us and within us, rather than just making promises about imaginary scenarios and what would have happened if and what if. I would therefore like to see the situation that Israel is in the reality around us, and this is not what I'm saying, also the head of the intelligence is saying this as well. It's one of the most complicated periods of time that Israel has been in ever, and when we look at what we have done over the last few decades and decisions that have had to do with Israeli security, we cannot run and make decisions without even attempting to learn from experience. So it's true that sometimes it's more interesting and easier to talk about bottles or garden furniture or all sorts of other such important topics, but yet we think that the discussion here should be about essence. And essence is to remember what happened to Israel over the last few decades. So what has happened here? The Oslo Accords, and again, I don't think anyone came from bad intentions. Everyone had good intentions. Everyone wanted to benefit and to better the situation for the Israeli citizens. But when we analyze once again from my perspective and from the Likud's perspective, what happened over the last few decades? So we had the Oslo Accords, in the framework of which we have brought Arafat and his gang here from Tunisia, and we hoped that that would build trust and that would build a political process at the end of which there will be peace and appeasement, and unfortunately it has led to Judea and Samaria becoming an incubator for terrorist organizations. We also had the unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon, led by the Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Barak, following which, of course, for years, many years, Hezbollah became stronger and gained power and capabilities, and the threat over our northern border, not only has it not disappeared, but in 2006, in the Second Lebanon War, Hezbollah allowed itself, I think something that we have never experienced before in the state of Israel, massive launching of thousands of rockets at the largest of Israeli cities. In between the withdrawal from Lebanon and the Second Lebanon War, we also had the disengagement, this euphemism for the unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and from there again, whether we like it or not, we can say that rockets were launched before then, before the unilateral withdrawal, but we cannot deny the fact that the figures were completely different, 10 times more after the withdrawal, and the capabilities of intelligence collection and the capabilities that the IDF has when in the Gaza Strip, rather than the much more complex capabilities we have to develop in order to cope with things as we have had to do during Protective Edge. So Hamas, consequently, in my view, following the withdrawal, has become stronger, was even elected in democratic elections, or we'll talk about this democracy perhaps later, and has also forcefully removed the Palestinian Authority people from there. And in 2011, after I have talked about the withdrawal from Lebanon and the Oslo Accords and the Second Lebanon War, which I didn't talk about, but ended with Resolution 1701, and you have to remember that because we talked about that also when we talk about the international collaterals and warranties for our safety here. Then Resolution 1701, led by Tzipi Livni, was supposed to stop Hezbollah from gaining more weapons and more sophisticated weapons. So Hezbollah had 8,000 rockets and missiles there, and now unfortunately they have 100,000 rockets and missiles that can reach each and every city and town in Israel. So after we talked about the Oslo Accords and the withdrawal and the Second Lebanon War and the disengagement, perhaps the peak, as far as I'm concerned, that we should be talking about and learning from is this Arab Spring in 2011, which I remember the masses in the Tahrir Square, and Thomas Friedman, and the head of the big publicist, and most of the Western leadership, who talked about the democracy coming to our region, and lo and behold, freedom and equality will abound in all the nations around us in the Middle East. And there was one leader who is sometimes very annoying also for commentators here and in the world, and who annoyed leaders. I think they called him then the party pooper. Yes, he ruined. They called him Benjamin Netanyahu, and he said that if I am correct, and from my experience and from what we in Israel here have experienced, when regimes, it's true, they have less democratic characteristics, but when they are toppled, sometimes a force that can organize more strongly and more quickly is the radical force, the radical Islam. And unfortunately, that's exactly what took place. That's exactly what is happening these days. So it's true, in Egypt, once in the democratic elections, the Muslim Brotherhoods were elected, and then there was a coup. Oh, sorry, I'm not allowed to say coup because the Americans don't acknowledge and recognize coups, not there, nor in Yemen, because otherwise they won't be able to continue budgeting those states. But yet, what happened there was a form of coup. military coup, and it's good that it happened, by the way. I'm not saying that it's bad for us, but in that interim period of time, what we have been experiencing from Sinai since then is the infiltration of world jihad organizations, and then that which has led to Eilat, our tourist attraction, becoming a destination and a target for missiles. And I can talk about Iraq and what is happening in Syria and what is happening in Lebanon and the instability all around us that really has culminated in unprecedented record. And in recent days we have heard in Congress, I think it was the head of the Counterterrorism Center in America, that they said they were surprised about the government being toppled in Yemen and how the Shiite faction took over. In the same way, he was surprised by the toppling of the Iraqi army in the face of the Islamic State of ISIS. And so before we begin talking about magic solutions and all sorts of tricks, we should perhaps learn two very significant lessons. And the intelligence, by the way, has learned these lessons and continually says so in the cabinet meetings, not covertly, also overtly in public speeches, that it is first of all impossible to know what will happen in our region. This toppling, this dismantlement and breakup have reached such heights that no one really can predict, and even if you have the best intelligence, almost everything is possible for that week or month, and you cannot really predict what forces will take the stage and what its impact will be, not for long term, definitely not even for the short or interim term. And my lesson, other than it being very difficult to predict, is that every area we have withdrawn, even if it was from good intentions, has not improved our security status. In my opinion, it has in fact made it worse. And so before we talk about, and I'm sure that the word arrangement or regional agreement has been said, or all sorts of hints and indications of such steps, I think that before we talk about these things, we should draw one conclusion. When we talk about Israeli security, we cannot take another chance. We cannot gamble again. We cannot rely on international forces that run away and escape as soon as they feel threatened, as has happened with the UN forces, or whose intelligence estimates have not really proven themselves, as can be seen from the examples I gave. We have a very responsible security estimate. We have very clear red lines. We will not tolerate damage to our sovereignty. We will not allow for top quality weapons going into these countries. It's not really under their control anymore, but the transport or passing of weapons to countries surrounding us. And we also will not accept non-conventional weapons from entering our region. And since I have also been presented with all sorts of questions and issues that I need to address, and since I was asked by the Institute, by the INSS, about the policy of intervention we adopted and whether we should initiate and be proactive in what is happening around us, then we say time and again, and we insist on it, we insist on this policy very much, that we do not intervene and we do not like to take sides in what is happening around us. It's usually asked in the Syrian context. I don't want to go into what Menachem Begin used to say during the Iran-Iraq war, when he said he wishes good luck to both sides. We're not saying that. Still, we're talking, unfortunately, about more than 200,000 people who have already been killed in Syria. But we are not intervening. We are not we are not expressing our position. We are extending humanitarian aid, because we think that in this respect Israel should really be a role model, but we do not like to take a position. And I would like to say please give me one more minute because you really took it out of my time at the beginning. I want to say that in the context of what said Protective Edge, that we are at the beginning of a new era of wars. Our enemies have understood that conventionally it is impossible to annihilate the state of Israel, and as we've said, there have been collapses of organizations that are terror organizations, and we don't want to say that we have given up. There are no indications of winning the war by winning various battles, but I wanted to mention the letter that President Obama wrote to Congress when he wanted permission once again to use military force against ISIS. So the empire, the strongest country in the world that is leading a coalition, heading a coalition of dozens of states against this organization that started out as slightly smaller than Hamas, perhaps it's now slightly bigger. What is the kind of schedule they're talking about when they're talking about defeating this organization? The President of the United States and a coalition of 60 other countries, they're not talking about 50 days during which they will defeat them. He wants permission for 3 years, and he's saying it perhaps won't end there. So as I've said, we are now in a completely different era when we are trying to fight a terrorist organization that hides behind civil population. That's what Hezbollah does, that's what Hamas does, and that's what ISIS does. When you're a country that takes into consideration human rights and wants to minimize the harm to uninvolved people, then you are in a much more complex arena than ever before. When you are dealing with terrorist organizations who you are still required to go according to the Geneva Convention with, and so forth, and you have the laws of war, and yet they do not have to follow the same laws and rules. You are in a completely different arena, and that is something that takes several years to study, to adjust to, and therefore I say once again that I think our activity today, if in the past we talked about the fact that the public diplomacy arena, and not only in terms of BDS perhaps is the attempt to initiate a ban or a boycott against Israel, but even in the war, on the battlefield, when we want continuous legitimacy for the fighting, in an era where everyone is a journalist, everyone has smartphones, and you can upload pictures from the battlefield. Of course, in the United States, you can only have, with the tourist organizations only put up pictures of those who are killed, not their teams who are launching missiles. But you are limited not only with your weapons, you need to invest in the budget of the public diplomacy and in the budget of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and everything that we do around the world in order to deal with these attempts to delegitimize the state of Israel. And I think that part of this activity should be by trying to change the international laws of war, rules of warfare, because we are now coping with organizations that do not follow these rules and laws, and they do launch missiles out of civil populations. So having said all of that, I do think that the criticism that we heard about Protective Edge is, I think, very hypocritical and even horrifying, especially when you hear it from people like Yair Lapid, my friend, or Tzipi Livni, who I saw throughout the operation supporting and backing up almost every decision proposed by the Prime Minister and headed by the Prime Minister, and it doesn't matter whether it's in the context of the humanitarian cessation of fighting that led to the tunnel digging and the unprecedented attack against the tunnels, the terror tunnels. I did not hear them saying then that we should go into preemptive campaigns against Hezbollah that has 100,000 rockets and missiles that can reach every city and town in Israel. To act against a terror tunnel and threats that Israel is facing requires timing, requires cautious policy, and we need to do it in the right context. And the same criticism that, I'm sorry, I'm going to call it baloney, it's complete baloney, about Gaza, as if there really was an opportunity. What, the Prime Minister doesn't want to demilitarize Gaza from weapons? Of course he does. Everyone does. Who will be the one who will demilitarize them? Abu Mazen, who has no access or control over the passages? The Hamas itself will decide to give up its weapons, and whoever says now, and I'm saying it to those on the right of the political map as well, if anyone is willing to demilitarize Hamas in Gaza or conquer it, then you have to look the public in the eye in Israel and tell them the real price that they are willing to pay in order to bring about this outcome. And since I really must end, I will say one final sentence, really one final sentence. I think that in the current state of affairs and based on what I have described, we would all like to be there and have peace tomorrow morning. But when we talk about our security and our lives, the first thing that we must remember is not to gamble. It's true, we need to negotiate and we call for negotiation, and it is very unfortunate that Abu Mazen continuously rejects our requests, but there are new opportunities. We have the Assisi initiative. We saw that Assisi has supported our campaign against the terror tunnels and has blamed Hamas for the situation. These are the partners that we definitely can promote. I don't want to talk about regional agreement because these are empty slogans used by my colleagues, but we definitely can promote a cooperation with them based on the fact that they like us, view similar threats in the same way. And I believe that if we stand together in this way, then hopefully with God's help, in a few years, more years or less years, we will find the right partner on the Palestinian side who will be willing to talk about concessions not only on the Israeli side but on the Palestinian side as well. Thank you very much.